At midnight on December 20th, 1989, the first bombs and missiles woke up the entire city of Panama. Because the American invasion had begun on Panamanian soil with the aim of capturing Manuel Noriega and ending his government. Although the then President of the United States, George Bush Sr., had stated that the reason for the invasion was to safeguard American lives in Panama, as well as to capture Noriega on major drug trafficking charges. The truth is that there is much more history to tell behind the real motives of the conflict. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking, and this is the New Encyclopedia. The invasion was the culmination of a series of long-standing events. We must begin by discussing Manuel Noriega. Noriega had a military career and was a key CIA ally. Yes, a very important ally of the United States in its fight against the communist insurgency in Central America. During the military government led by the Panamanian Rijos, which took power in Panama in 1968, Noriega quickly rose to become the head of military intelligence. As the head of Panamanian intelligence, he becomes a valuable asset for the CIA in the region. In the early 70s, Noriega allows American posts to be set up in Panama to intercept and spy on conversations. He allows the country to be used as a base to aid counterinsurgent forces and to be used as a free route for arms trafficking. That helps to confront the guerrillas in El Salvador and Nicaragua. On the other hand, it was also from the 70s when Noriega ventured into the drug trafficking business. As the head of Panamanian intelligence and a CIA protege, he used all his influence to make Panama a free passage site for drugs being trafficked from Central and South America to the north and to Europe. And the American government knew this very well. Drug Enforcement Administration officials and other security agencies had warned about illegal operations in Noriega. Despite Noriega's actions, the United States continued to support the valuable Panamanian intelligence agent. To understand the path to the American invasion in Panama, it is very important to point out, first of all, that the United States, for a long time, had a strong political and economic influence in the Central American region. Secondly, and equally important in Panama's case, it is very fundamental that we take into account that the United States not only had a political ally in this area, but it had control of a space of infinite importance towards which we cannot understand this story, which is the Panama Canal. Since the colonial era, there was already awareness of the great potential that this space had, which connected the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. During the 19th century, the Panamanian territory was still part of Colombia, and countries like France had unsuccessfully tried to build a canal in this region. However, the United States supported sectors of Panama that wanted to separate from Colombia, and in fact, that's what happened in 1903. When Panama declared its independence, the United States was one of the first to recognize the new country as a sovereign nation, and immediately manages to sign, with the endorsement of the Panamanian elites, a very important treaty that granted the United States full rights to build a canal in the Isthmus of Panama, as well as perpetual rights to manage the canal once it was fully built and operational. This document was called the Habuno-Varilla Treaty. In addition, total control over the Panama Canal meant the establishment of U.S. military bases in Panama, as well as the creation of the so-called Canal Zone, a territory of 8 kilometers within Panama, but belonging to the United States, which included the canal itself and the surrounding lands, waters, and airspaces. The canal was inaugurated in 1914 and since then had been under complete United States control. Now, already from the 30s, this treaty begins to be harshly questioned by political sectors of Panama. Opposition to the United States having full control over the canal increased over time, leading to various struggles such as on January 9, 1964. A crowd of Panamanian students heads to Balboa High School, which was located within the Canal Zone, to remove the American flag and raise the Panamanian flag. This led to shooting confrontations between the protesters and the American military, leaving dozens of people dead, which of course caused a great international uproar. This event is commemorated today in Panama as Martyrs' Day. It led to, among other things, the breakdown of relations between Panama and the United States, and it started a process of negotiations from 1970 which culminated with the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977, Mirren. This is essential to understand the issue of the invasion, because in this treaty, Panama and the United States agree. The handover to Panama of the territory around the canal for 1979, as well as the handover of the canal administration to Panamanian citizens. By the beginning of 1990, as a preliminary step for the total return of the canal to Panama. By December of 1999. This treaty also temporarily legalized American military bases on Panamanian territory, but when the treaty expired, these had to be closed and all American soldiers had to leave. All this also in exchange for the Panamanian military government adopting a sort of democratic opening. From here you can get an idea of the tensions that have existed between both countries for quite some time. Returning to Noriega, despite the fact that he was an important ally of the Americans, he and Torrijos were involved in treaties that granted Panama sovereignty over the canal. In the U.S., the Republicans strongly disliked the Democratic Carter administration's signing of this treaty, and they considered it a major geopolitical setback. In 1980, the Republican Ronald Reagan assumes the presidency of the United States, and interest groups began to press for the repeal of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty, and even for new concessions to be given to the Americans regarding the canal. This is also fundamental, keep it in mind for later. The drug trade was booming in the early 1980s, creating a complex situation for United States geopolitics. But also the civil conflicts with the increasingly aggressive leftist insurgency in this region, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia in Colombia, the Sandinista National Liberation Front in Nicaragua, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador, and the Guerrilla Army of the Poor in Guatemala. In this scenario, for the time being, the Americans could not go against Panama, which was their most important ally in the Central American region at this time. Now, since the beginning of the 80s. A report made by the same United States Defense Intelligence Agency states that Noriega has control over drug-related activities and money laundering in the Central American region. And Noriega did this through a group of close associates within the Panamanian Army. The U.S. government knew very well who they were dealing with, and despite this, they continued to support him and even allowed or promoted his accumulation of power in Panama. Even George Bush Sr., when he was the director of the CIA, met with Noriega several times. However, all of this began to change when Noriega started to distance himself from the United States. Torrijos, the leader of Panama's military regime, died in 1981. Noriega assumes as the commander-in-chief of the National Guard. Then in 1984, presidential elections are held, after 16 years without elections, and President Nicolas Ardito Barletta was elected. However, according to various analysts, all of this was a facade. The one who ruled the country de facto was Noriega and his military. That same year, Noriega demands and achieves the closure of the School of the Americas, which was in Panama. This was a key area of U.S. military influence in that country. This begins to sharpen again the already tense relations with the North American power. In turn, Noriega exercised his command in an authoritarian manner, and his image abroad began to deteriorate. He pursued and exiled dissidents. The media that he could not buy, he shut down, and any protest was harshly suppressed. The democratic opening that had been agreed upon by Panama had completely stalled. As I mentioned earlier, during these same years, Reagan and later Bush Sr. began to make new demands on the Panamanian government. These even included renegotiating the transfer of the Canal administration, which had been scheduled for 1990. Noriega refuses the United States' demands, causing the country to worry as it seemed Noriega was no longer accountable to them. In this regard, since 1985, North American political groups began to ask for ways to remove him from power. However, officials such as the CIA director continued to support Noriega. In 1985, Noriega orders the assassination of Hugo Espadafora, a politician highly critical of the de facto government's management. And he also ends a coup attempt that was led by Roberto Diaz Herrera, a high-ranking military officer who had denounced Noriega's actions during the last years. The U.S. demands changes in Panama's government, but Noriega responds negatively. All these factors, the concern of the United States about their lack of control over Noriega, the bad image that their authoritarian Central American ally gave to the rest of the world. The Panamanian dictator had extensive knowledge about CIA activities and the ongoing tension surrounding the Panama Canal. All these factors finally led to a new state of open conflict between both countries. The U.S. government decides to break trade relations with Panama, applying sanctions on that country, and the CIA at last stopped paying Noriega for his information. In that, the federal courts of Miami and Tampa from 1986 began working on the arrest warrants against Noriega on charges of drug trafficking and money laundering, and President Ronald Reagan uses these charges as a tool to negotiate with Noriega so that he resigns in exchange for these convictions being forgotten. In February 1988, Tampa and Miami formally filed drug trafficking charges against Noriega. And as a result of this, the then president of Panama, named Eric Del Valle, decides to dismiss Noriega as head of the defense forces. But the Assembly of Representatives of Panama did not agree, and Noriega even less so. And he uses the power he has in the army to disregard Del Valle as president, who ends up fleeing to the United States for protection. Subsequently, Manuel Solis Palma, an ally of General Noriega and Minister of Education, was appointed as the acting president of Panama. The U.S. started an open blockade against the government loyal to Panama's military. This caused an economic crisis, even leading to the freezing of banks to prevent capital flight. We are facing the last events that triggered the invasion. In May of 1989, new elections are held in Panama. Opposition candidate Guillermo Endara faced Carlos Duque, Noriega's candidate. The opposition allegedly won those elections, but Noriega ordered the suspension of the elections, alleging foreign interference in the process. In response, the United States government announces it will recognize Guillermo Endara, Noriega's opposition, as president. However, the State Council of Panama appoints Comptroller Francisco Rodriguez as provisional president until new elections are held. In the following days, Noriega's paramilitary forces, the so-called Dignity Battalions, attacked a protest that was led by opposition candidates claiming fraud. During the protest, multiple demonstrators suffered severe injuries, including vice presidential candidate Guillermo Ford. And what happened? Well, the images of this repression went around the world. And the newly elected George Bush, Sr., with whom Noriega had had contact several years before, used those same images to alert the world about what was happening in Panama. The United States applies new economic sanctions against Panama, and relations completely broke down. The invasion was already served on the table. The situation escalated, and weeks before December 20th, Panama was already at war with the United States. Noriega was becoming more violent and refused to negotiate with us. On October 3rd, Panamanian military personnel, supported by the United States, attempted an unsuccessful coup against Noriega. Then, on December 15, 1989, the Legislative Assembly grants special powers to Noriega, appointing the War Cabinet chiefs. While declaring the Republic of Panama formally in a state of war against the United States, Washington claimed that civilian and American troops were being threatened by the Panamanian government, although the American army had been preparing the attack for months. Two incidents, according to Bush, ultimately triggered the invasion. On December 16th, 4 members of the American staff were detained at a checkpoint in the El Carrillo neighborhood of Panama City, in a confusing event that remains unclear to this day. One of the 4 detainees, First Lieutenant Roberto Paz of the United States Marine Corps, was killed with a shot to the head. A witness claimed that Paz was somewhat irreverent towards the Panamanian military, who then pushed the lieutenant, and afterwards a shot took his life. However, the Pentagon claimed that the American soldiers were lost and that they were unarmed. Although these statements go against the testimonies presented by the witnesses who lived in the area, and the second trigger is that Lieutenant Adam Curtis and his wife Bonnie were also arrested and allegedly mistreated by Panamanian forces. Following this, Operation Just Cause, as the Americans called it, began in the early morning of December 20th, 1989, with bombings of strategic sites of the Panamanian Defense Forces, especially the command post that was located in the Carrillo neighborhood, which was completely razed this neighborhood. The American fire left many innocent civilian casualties. In subsequent hours, American Army troops took other key points amid intense fighting in urban areas and inhabited areas. The sea, air, and land teams' forces were in charge of destroying vehicles and destroying Noriega's private plane to prevent him from escaping. The fighting continued throughout that December 20th and subsequent days. Amidst the disaster in the capital, there was looting and violence in the streets. There were also shootings and skirmishes between American and Panamanian forces. But despite the siege by the American forces, Noriega manages to slip away and takes refuge in the Apostolic Nunciature, the 24th of December. And there he was, besieged by the American army, who, with loudspeakers and blasting rock music at full volume, tormented Noriega and the entire Nuncio headquarters, until the 3rd of January 1990, when the dictator decides to surrender. It should be noted that this process cost the lives of innocent civilians. Official American figures speak of 202 civilian casualties. The official Panamanian figure indicates that there were between 472 and 500 civilian casualties, and human rights organizations claim that the casualties exceed 1,000 civilians killed. For example, the Association of the Fallen of December 20th, 1989, claims at least 4,000 innocent casualties occurred. History is shaped by the vision and interests of those who tell it. The official American version seeks to justify the invasion as an act to protect the citizens and American military personnel who were in Panama, as well as to overthrow the drug trafficking dictator Noriega in the name of democracy and legality. However, it should not be overlooked that Noriega was a significant asset of the CIA and a leader of a very key country for the United States, especially because of the Panama Canal, and that this leader had ceased to be functional to the U.S. government and held significant secrets. Moreover, after the invasion, the American government ensured that a government friendly to their interests took the reins of Panama. This allows them to maintain significant geostrategic control in the region. However, it's also true that the invasion toppled a military dictatorship that lasted over 21 years. And that in Panama, a process of economic prosperity was generated hand-in-hand with its most important trading partner. Thanks for watching. Please support us by commenting, subscribing, and liking the video.